I know this is one of those things that you're probably not supposed to do, like picking a favorite among your children, but I've been part of this conference for 5 years now, and I've been a part of or been able to listen to a lot of different panels, but I don't recall looking forward to a panel as much as I have this upcoming panel. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Naila Baddoo, who right now is the startup host and executive producer of The 21st, which is a statewide news talk show produced by Illinois Public Radio. But we will forever claim Naila as one of our own because she got her degree from the Medill Journalism School at Northwestern, and most recently was a host of a midday show at the NPR affiliate WBEZ here in Chicago. And so she has actually moderated panels for us in the past. And when we decided to put together this Meet the Press panel, we decided that we should have somebody who's in the media, who knows how to handle the media, do this. And so we were glad to be able to reach out to Naila, and very happy that you agreed to do this for us. So I will say that Chuck Todd's got nothing on you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Naila Baddoo.
Thanks, Jerry. Wow, what an intro. Thanks, all of you. And I want to introduce our panel in a minute, but I know you guys all day have been sort of talking about the whole idea of our regional economy. And we know that this is the economy centered around Chicago is the third largest in the country. And what we wanted to talk about today is, do we really act that way? Do our political leaders act that way? How is this? What is the reality on the ground? And that's sort of the point of this panel from the perspectives of all of us who work in the media. We're going to talk about the things that do grab the headlines when you talk about economic competitiveness, which of course would be Foxconn and now Amazon. But we also want to go beyond that a little bit and look at transportation, on water, and other issues that maybe aren't as sexy, but maybe where politicians are working together. So let me just introduce our panel. Joining me today, Greg Hinz is a political writer and columnist and blogger for Crain's Chicago Business, and he covers politics and government, everything from City Hall to the State House and General Assembly, and with a special interest in urban development and transportation. Jed Diedlow is the owner of WJOB in Hammond, Indiana, where he also hosts its morning show. And John Schmidt focuses on economic change and globalization for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And my show is actually airs on 5 stations throughout the state. So while my home station is based in Champaign-Urbana, we go as far south as Springfield and up to Rockford. So a little bit out of this MSA today, but in my past life as a business reporter, covered a lot of these regional economic issues. So gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you today. And I thought we could start, John, why don't we start with you? If everybody, I think Chicago's always the heavyweight in the room. So Greg, I'm going to let you go last. But John, if you could start with just sort of the view from Milwaukee in terms of what it looks like in terms of regional cooperation.
Oh, thanks.
Sure.
I'm originally from Chicago, and I spent a bunch of my career in different parts of the world after that. And so when I ended up in Milwaukee, the idea of a story about creating a 21 county, 3-state, 3-city metroplex makes total sense. It's like Shanghai. It's like intuitive that you would want this, economies of scale. These regions share near identical urban issues, and that came up earlier with the question from Dr. Ruffalo from Marquette and and the guy who talked about collective impact in the Woodlawn neighborhood. But there are rural issues, and there's an awful lot of natural sort of cohesion that would take place in this region. And so from the perspective of Milwaukee, it's an area that would honestly should be looking for any economic competitive advantage that it can. The journalistic question is, will these regions make it? And here's a couple data points that you probably haven't heard. Milwaukee's the 3rd poorest city in the nation at last count. Yeah, it lacks the vibrancy of downtown Chicago for sure. Wisconsin is woefully far behind on startup activities. Wisconsin has lagged the nation in job creation since 2011. So these are the kind of metrics where you should be thinking that it's a no-brainer to try to stitch the area together. But I went back and looked, and I've been writing about this story since 2012 on and off. And one of the themes that has always come up is that this idea, as intuitive and as important and as critical as it is, doesn't get much of a hearing. The gentleman in the previous panel talked about how the Wisconsin effort to create a regional transportation authority was killed. There was quite a political backstory on that, but there's just very little by the way of recognition that there could be any kind of policy integration in the region. There's job poaching. There's actually competition in areas where you could easily imagine that there should be cohesion. So it doesn't seem to be happening. And I guess as a journalist, because I ask questions, it seems like this body, the Alliance, really should be the agency that we should be watching to create the 21 county coordination effort and get that underway. But I guess the question that I have is and I'll just leave it with this, but if the idea is to be competitive in an era of globalization, to really understand that the rivals are in China, it seems like we're having this conversation in a political environment right now where it's really hard to get a hearing for globalization competitiveness issues. There's a big body in the United States right now, politically speaking, in this environment, that's anti-NAFTA. The Trans-Pacific Trade Pact, similarly discredited, even though it's meant to project American influence into Asia. NATO has come under attack, to my great astonishment, for considering that it won the Cold War. Just very recently, UNESCO and the Paris Clean Air Pact. So it seems like the people who are organizing this effort have an upstream battle, because if it wasn't tough enough to get the debate started, right now it's a very difficult environment for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, John. Jed, when we think about Indiana, I'm thinking about during the worst, well, I don't know what point would be the worst of the budget standoff and impasse in Illinois, but having Indiana's economic development director on my program talking about how this was a great opportunity and how many companies were being lured across the border. We all remember the Illinois signs that went up. What's going on in Northwest Indiana these days?
Which is very much my surprise when I was asked to talk on this panel about cooperation, when up until this point I thought we were supposed to just steal Illinois businesses that are Illinois by taxes. I can tell you this, it's kind of weird. I haven't been up here ever in this building, and I was walking up through the Board of Trade area here, where I traded for 18 years before buying some media properties. And it just kind of came back to me, walking into those pits every day with all Illinois people, maybe one or two other Hoosiers and maybe one or two other Wisconsin people out of, say, 300 or 400 men standing there. And every time there was a joke about a farm or a steel mill or some sort of negative industrial thing, they all looked at me and they all pointed and, hey, were you involved in that? Was that your F-150 with the saw cutter on the back that I saw on the side of the Dan Ryan? And really what it comes down to is, in my mind, is that it's an image problem, specifically for Indiana and Northwest Indiana. There's a whole bunch of folks here that are from Northwest Indiana that are working on that. But before we can get past and we can talk about the great transportation projects that we have coming, the good water, or we have good water in Hammond and Gary and the airport and all of those things, we have to be taken seriously by Chicago to be part of this. And it's almost an overwhelming task to be able to make our imprint. And that is I had a kid up in Wisconsin, so I went to Madison, drive through the city all the time, and then you get to Indiana, and you just get a different feel. And I don't mean this to any of the people from the Illinois side, but we get a feeling as if we are looked down upon and not wanted. And I see John here shaking his head. So this effort is a great effort. And I'm like, all right, 3 states together. Think about that imprint. It's like a country, what we could all do together. But right now, politically, economically, the groups don't talk to each other. I bring the economic development people on the show. First thing they're talking about is, hey, we got this company from Illinois. We poached this one. I don't see a lot of existing working together. And quite frankly, unless there's a grassroots movement that I'm not aware of, I just don't see it happening right now. So I'm glad to be part of the discussion, but I'm just going to be honest about it. And the other thing I wanted to say is the reason that I've never been in this building is because when you're standing in the pits of the Board of Trade, anything that starts with Fed, you stay away. So I'm out. I'm actually sweating right now. Hey, there you go.
Oh, Greg, go ahead. Greg?
Well, my colleagues have done a pretty good job so far about bringing a pail of cold water to those of you who are great believers in Kumbaya. It's regional. Regional divisions. I don't know why there's regional divisions. Any good Chicagoan could tell you that somebody from Wisconsin is a cheesehead. And that, as I've written in my column more than once, one of the great economic advantages that Indiana has is the electricity bills are low because it glows in the dark at night. So, but there's a little hope here that I'm going to get to. But first, I want to put a couple more leaves on the tree. New politicians, in some ways, are Rorschach tests for what's really going on in the world. That's why I find it really interesting that our new U.S. Senator, Tammy Duckworth, last year, or this year, had her first maiden bill. The thing she's always going to talk about her entire career is what is the one thing she accomplished first. What did she do? She passed a bill to block a proposed federal rule that would have effectively merged the Chicago metropolitan area for planning with its counterparts in southeast Wisconsin and northwest Indiana and forced them all to work together on the same page. And the reason they did it is there was a unanimous feeling in all those states of, what? Run my transportation priorities by the governor of Indiana or Rahm Emanuel or Scott Walker? We don't want to do that. We want to be independent. That is indeed the mindset that you all are having to deal with. It's just a reality. There was a great example of that recently with Foxconn, which congratulations to the folks in Wisconsin. It's going to go there. They're talking maybe 10,000 jobs, $3 billion in incentives, and their action from the politicians in Illinois was, well, great. We might be able to get some of those jobs for our people without having to spend the money. They can spend it up in Wisconsin. And the reaction from some of the public officials up in Wisconsin was, hey, can't we add a clause in this contract that they have to hire from Wisconsin only? That's the reality that you're dealing with. Even though the bigger reality is that, and you know this better than I do, competition now is by region. It's not by city. It's not by state. Chicago is competing not so much with Cincinnati or Kansas City or St. Louis. It's competing with London and Paris and Frankfurt. And in that competition, one of our strategic advantages, other than that big pile of blue water over there, a few blocks to the east, is our labor pool and the fact that our labor pool is cheaper than the labor pool in New York and London. And it would be even cheaper if we brought into our fold smaller cities that are close, like Indiana and Milwaukee, and specialized out some of the functions. You don't need to have all the big, maybe have the big fancy headquarters functions and pay a ton of money in downtown Chicago, but there's other stuff that you need if you're a bank or a finance company or you're in media or whatever. And we do a lousy job of coordinating that and getting those people into our job market, clearly, transportation feeds your ability to offer world-class talent at competitive prices. We do a lousy job of doing that, even though it's in our self-interest. And it's because we tend to be parochial. We take care of ourselves and we don't care about anybody else. Now, there's a way sometimes to work that to your advantage, though. Those of you who are familiar with Illinois politics will probably know for the last 2 years, our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and our governor, Bruce Rauner, spent every day throwing bricks at each other's head. Oh, that budget, CPS, is Chicago Public Schools, is a terrible outfit. We can't spend money there. Oh, Bruce Rauner hates Chicago. It went on for 2 full years until they finally agreed on a budget and they passed it. But yet, here comes down the road Amazon company. Lets it be known that, gee, we're thinking of setting up a new headquarters with 50,000 jobs that pay $100,000 a year each. Have you seen one word of nastiness between Rahm Emanuel and Bruce Rauner since that news came out? No, not one. In fact, by all indications, they and their staffs are working very closely together. My point is, if you're going to get things done in life, you got to show the great promise at the end of the rainbow, the bucket of gold. You need to, the concept of, oh, it's good for us, and we need to work together, and it's a little inconvenient, but it'll help us out. It's like telling people to eat their peas. It doesn't work. You need to show the great promise, as in Amazon. Here's what you could have. Here's what you could run for re-election on. That's you all, and us in the media too. If we're going to get on the same page, we have to focus more on finding things like that to offer people and less on the negatives.
So I want to go back to Amazon in a second. I want to ask about Foxconn. And by the way, we are going to take questions. So be thinking of your questions that you have for all of us. We're going to get to that at the end of this. Let me ask you just about Amazon first, though, before we get to Foxconn, Greg. Interestingly, Governor Rauner is also working with St. Louis and saying, I don't know how closely, but saying also, if we have the Amazon headquarters in St. Louis, that's also good for Illinois. So I'm curious the thoughts, and anyone jump in here, but Greg, why don't you start with just the notion of he's getting that, the regionalization, at least from the Amazon perspective. If he's obviously publicly talking about Chicago, but then also saying, well, we're also working with the St. Louis area because we know that we have East St. Louis and all of that downstate.
If you talk to the governor's people privately, they wouldn't put it this way, but what they say is that was a little bit of disinformation. If you're Bruce Rauner and you're the governor of Illinois and you're running for re-election in Illinois and there's votes in the St. Louis area and Metro East, and the city right across the river is going to put in a bid, you can't publicly diss it. You throw them a bone. But I guarantee you, what they're pushing for, because they think the facts line up that way, is that Chicago is the real bidder, not St. Louis.
Let's talk about Foxconn for a minute, John. Do you did Wisconsin win? Did Wisconsin lose? What's sort of the sentiment there politically? I'm curious in terms of reaction.
That question will have its real definitive answer in 5 or 10 years from now. On the one hand, it's supposed to be a hyper-automated facility that integrates artificial intelligence. So you're talking high-end technological manufacturing. And that's supposed to be the great leveler between, say, low-cost production areas like Vietnam and China and the United States. So it'll be a great testing ground for that theory. It'll be a nice initial shock of or burst or catalyst for some economic development, for sure. There's no doubt that it was selected on the 94 corridor there between Milwaukee and Chicago precisely because of the proximity to Chicago. Notwithstanding, and I've heard all those jokes too, and the bitterness on both sides. You know, we're paying so that those fibs can have our jobs. And that's if it works. Unfortunately, the thing that doesn't go away with this, to your question, is the argument that one hears across the spectrum. And I did a lot of my reporting on these stories by calling Asia, calling folks in China who know Terry Gou, who is Foxconn, the founder, talking to folks in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and even in Tokyo, because they've got a big Foxconn stake now. The logic is more political than economic, disproportionately so. If it was economic, if there was strong, clearly articulated economic reasons for Foxconn to come to the United States, then the debate might be a little different. There'd be fewer skeptics around, but it is very economic. The current political environment, again, is anti-trade pact. How do you keep in the good graces of the United States? How do you avert any tariffs, any fees, any penalties by investing in the United States? So many people see Foxconn as a response to that part of the political climate. And
So it wasn't a mistake by accident that it went into Paul Ryan's district.
that's what I hear. That's what folks say, call them skeptics or not. However, you can't stand in the way of globalization either. It will have a positive impact for those people in this room who are trying to further that civic debate on regionalization. If Foxconn gets off the ground, if this large facility is built, it could easily advance the idea of moving that commuter metro line from Kenosha north. And there are business folks who've been screaming for that forever, not just rail enthusiasts who see the advantage of rail, but the clear business strategy for that. It'll be interesting to watch, but it's really quite too early to say what level of investment Foxconn's going to bring to the region.
Right, and I guess I'm curious about the political, sort of what the political conversation is. I mean, to a little bit more to Greg's point, is everybody at this point saying this was at this point worth the investment? What are you, from a political standpoint?
Is everybody saying it's
Politicians, or what are politicians saying about it?
There was when it came down to voting, it became very partisan. Again, I have to go back to economics. In talking to the people in Asia about what is Foxconn's interest, they all said it's political. There are now, the idea is to build something called 8K screens. They have resolutions that's beyond what your eye can even discern as pixels anymore. So it's going to be the one of the most extremes you're ever going to get until we get 3D holographic images. Maybe that's going to be the next thing to come out of Racine, Wisconsin. But in China already and in Japan, there are already not just Foxconn, but a handful of fierce competitors building these screens and prepared to ship them all across the world. Prices are dropping on them. There is already, and if you want to just talk about economic terms, a very, what looks like a market that is being satisfactorily met in terms of supply and demand for these screens. What are you going to add by continuing to produce them in a region in Wisconsin that does not have the ecosystem, does not have the economics around it of consumer electronics, has higher wages? You're adding capacity at higher cost to an industry that some analysts that you can find right now who write these reports says is already at capacity. So it's really quite an open-ended question. It might be visionary and it might not be.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Let me add to that just a little bit. Given the price tag, $3 billion plus for maybe 10,000 jobs, I don't think he could have sold that deal to Illinois. I don't think our legislature would have approved it. Not that we're a Bernie Sanders state, we were a Hillary Clinton state, but not by a lot. I think instructive was the recent Democratic gubernatorial debate about 10 days ago, in which the question of Amazon came up. And amongst most of the candidates, the reaction was, well, why do we want to pay welfare to those guys? Can't we do something for our poor people instead of throwing money at big rich corporations? Of the leading candidates, The only guy who, in my opinion, gave the right answer was J.B. Pritzker, who said, well, you look at what you're offering and you look at what they're giving and you see if it's a good deal. And if it's not a good deal, you say no. That's the right answer. But
Is that the right political answer?
yeah, I think for reasons of people, yes. But can the thing be demagogued? You bet. If Rahm Emanuel, if Saints Preserve, if Amazon decides to come up here, and Rahm Emanuel thinks he can do his little tap dance in the city council and run it all through with 5 minutes notice and no public hearings, he's going to lose. They're going to have to sell this deal.
Can I follow up on the Amazon deal? Would you consider Bruce Rauner and Rahm Emanuel, the silence between them and the behind-the-scenes dealing with Amazon is a real possibility? I mean, is it something that is genuine?
All I can tell you is what the people involved are saying and what outside observers who I trust are saying is that if you look at what Amazon says it's looking for, Chicago fits the bill.
Okay, so let me just use this as a real-world example of what I started to talk about. Bruce Rauner is pursuing Amazon, and it's real. Gary Mayer, Karen Freeman Wilson writes a letter, puts it in the New York Times, and it is actually laughed about on Chicago television in a number of different areas. And the giving of welfare to Amazon in Indiana would probably not be nearly as big of an issue, and that we would take we would certainly take that and move that over. But I guess I'm just showing, just a real world example of the different image. Yeah.
I mean, because I think it's a question of, and I think that's, Greg, you would say from Chicago's perspective, like not the laughing aside, but just when we look at, you're talking about labor pools, I guess when we talk about the reality of what exists between, if we're comparing Milwaukee to Gary to Northwest Indiana to the Chicago area, where is the incentive for Chicago to reach out to Northwest Indiana?
The incentive for Chicago to reach out is that if the city has a bigger effective labor pool and more resources they can bring to the table, that has more to offer potential employers. It's that simple. But is somewhat of an attitude adjustment going to be probably necessary? Yes. But it's sometimes you need to do things in your own self-interest. You have to eat a little bit of crow.
So let's talk about, I mean, you brought up Senator Duckworth and transportation. I wonder if we can spend a minute talking about, just for example, the RTA, and where that's at, where we're looking at. Transportation sort of always seems to be the logical place where there's a clear need to work together. And any of you guys jump in here in terms of where, if we see, is there any room for hope or success in what we've seen with regional transportation work?
You know, I'll jump on that. Obviously, I don't know if you guys have talked about this morning, but obviously looking at a $1 billion extension of one of the few train extensions in America that we're looking at right now in two directions. And ultimately, that is to bring people to downtown Chicago. And for whatever reason, it doesn't, it's just kind of an Indiana thing saying, all right, we're going to build this train, we're going to extend it into the neighborhoods, and we're going to send our people to Chicago to get jobs and bring their money back. But is there any real cooperation between that? I mean, I don't really see it, but I can see how, I mean, if you really thought about it, what would this thing, and I know there's people here that are going to say this is heresy because they work for the South Shore, but if you really looked at it, if all the spokes went out and they were part of the same piece from downtown Chicago all the way to South Bend and into Lowell and all of that, then you would have a much stronger transportation system to present to people like Amazon.
Right.
I have to say that you're correct that the cooperation between the Illinois folks and the Indiana folks on transportation is limited. But even within the state of Illinois, I wouldn't brag too much about what the RTA has done. Yes, there is a common funding stream. Yes, they all kind of sit at the table, but there's all kinds of things they could do that they haven't done. We still don't have a uniform. Only in the last year or so if we start to get a uniform fare structure, which is piece one in coordinating transportation.
Great. And so do we look to, where is a good model for this? Do we look to like a London? Where do we look for a transportation model of how this should work well? New York?
Europe. That's what stitched all of Europe together. You've got dissimilar cultures and languages. Europe is still integrating itself under the currency that it created.
Or disintegrating, actually, if we can say. But.
Well, to that point, you'll notice that the rail network of Europe is very cohesive. It has everything that the RTA could ever dream of, but it doesn't reach Greece. Just think about that. But when I was in Chicago, I covered the RTA, and it was a very Republican-run, very proud organization. The Republican Party of Wisconsin is almost equally proud that it's anti-rail. I can't begin to fathom what the political thinking is that is anti-rail when rail can...
Yeah, the link to Madison that Scott Walker killed.
Well, the idea of extending a metro commuter rail as sort of a Foxconn instigated idea would resurrect an old project that already died once. The bullet train between Chicago, Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Waukesha, Madison, and Minneapolis, that was actually a live idea. I think it died for, it's fair to say, political indifference in Wisconsin.
Let's talk a minute about water, just really briefly before we get to questions. Because John, when we were kind of preparing for this, you were talking about Milwaukee, and that is sort of for you that is sort of a point of you see visionary regional leadership there. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I come at it like everything from the perspective of a journalist, and when you have an opportunity to write about a new global sector that's growing, that's in clear demand, that's green, that's global, then it's cool, it's sexy. It's really interesting to watch how intuitive it is, how people get it. Oh, water technology, water management, water policy, water, the resource that everyone needs, water for life, the quintessential resource. It's ever dirtier, ever pricier. It's a commodity that everyone used to take for granted, and talk to people in California or Atlanta or Beijing or the people on the Ganges in India, and they'll say, no, we don't take it for granted. So the idea is very intuitive, and it caught on like nothing I've ever seen before. It's in its growth phases. The folks in Milwaukee, some of them are in this room, who are piloting that project, have seen it grow really quickly to the point where they routinely go on trade missions to India and China and the Middle East just to suss out where this market is going. So it's got potential. Chicago may be the 800-pound gorilla in the region, no doubt. No one's going to dispute that it's a global city. But it's probably Milwaukee's best opportunity for some leadership on a regional issue.
I want to get to questions in the room. You guys can ask us anything. We have good representation here because we have kind of industry, business pub, commercial radio, newspaper, public radio. So you can ask us whatever you want to ask us about our industries and how we cover this. So are we going to do, okay, Jerry's got the mic. And it would be great if we had questions. I know people probably also have statements they want to make, but if we could start with questions, that would be great.
To our radio people, why does WBEZ ignore Indiana? And Jeb, the question to you is, does your signal powerful enough to get to the Illinois border?
Goes to downtown Chicago, to Joliet. Got about an FM that goes downtown.
Oh,
yeah, and
I thought it was a
actually
3-watt station.
And
WBEZ actually is a Northwest Indiana bureau.
Yeah, they have
so
a
Michael Puente, they have a reporter in Crown Point. WBEZ has a bureau in Crown Point, Indiana, and Michael Puente is based there.
How many days of the week?
Well, he's a reporter, so he's sleeping most of the time. So Okay, I'm not gonna, I think all public radio reporters work pretty hard, so I'm not gonna comment on that, but Northwest Indiana is part of WBEZ's local bureau strategy. So there are bureaus on the south side of the city, the north side of the city, the west side of the city, and Northwest Indiana. And Michael does lots of reporting for Indiana. And he's on my show, he's on, we also, all of the public radio stations throughout the state cooperate with Indiana public radio stations and also Missouri public radio stations and share content. So Michael's stories about Indiana are actually on the air all over Illinois.
I'll follow up on that. Michael Puente used to work for me, and of all the Chicago-based radio stations and, quite frankly, even television stations, probably the public radio gives the best coverage of Northwest Indiana. I don't know why that is, but it's just maybe it's just because of the one guy, but they cover us all the time.
Nyla, when you introduced this panel, you posed the question, do the leaders of each of the respective sub areas act and think consistent with regional cooperation? I'd be interested in knowing from each of your panelists if the citizens in their regions think and act consistent with regional cooperation.
The short answer is probably no. I think probably a good example of that was a few years ago when the Republicans last ran government in Illinois, they tried to take over O'Hare. And it was largely a big fight over patronage and who gets to hand out big contracts and so forth. And the way the city was able to get around that was to cite an old obscure state law and give a bunch of money to Gary, to its airport. So we can't have this airport in Peatone. We already have another regional airport in Gary. And it was a political stunt. Everybody knew it was a political stunt. But there was a real effort by some folks, in part out of here, to try to revive Gary as an alternate to Peatone. I wrote about it a ton. I don't think it got a lot of pickup, but boy, did it make a lot of sense, because you have an area that clearly needs economic development that's 20 minutes away from the loop. If you can't put together the economics and growth potential there, but nobody really jumped on it because it was on the wrong side of the border and none of the Illinois politicians wanted to send a bunch of money to Indiana. And I didn't see any, to answer your question, I didn't see any citizen outrage about the lack of action.
Jed, what about it? There was, I imagine though, I mean, that's always been still foremost in the minds of folks in Northwest Indiana.
I'll give you an example. I mean, obviously the real short answer is absolutely not. The only thing that people of like Lake and Porter County of Indiana, which is in this MSA, are more wary of than Chicago is Indianapolis. So as you well know, but the answer is, I'll give you an example. We're trying to put a $50 million emergency center, MAC, multi-agency coordination center in Northwest Indiana, and there's momentum for it. And then there started to be some momentum with coordination with folks in Chicago, and putting the nuclear blast zones and where would we put the center just outside the blast zone, and then we would work with Chicago to get this done in the state of Illinois. As soon as that came into the equation, the thing lost steam very quickly because of the lack of trust in doing anything large across the border. So there's very few things that I see where people and my listeners and callers and that have any sort of trust to work across the state line.
What about Milwaukee, John?
I sort of feel like I'm dovetailing on what both said already. Just when you get around to Greg in particular with his funny cheesehead and joke and Hoosier jokes, there is an equivalent.
You did say fib. I feel like I should point out. It goes both ways.
As a reporter, I just quote what other people say.
No, I mean, I'm just saying.
John, let me just say on behalf of the people of Chicago, I hope your quarterback gets well real fast right after the end of the season.
Oh, man. All right.
Greg, I'm hurt, you know. In Wisconsin, we're in mourning right now. The Packers are a state religion, and we mustn't make fun of religion. But there's a similar sort of dinner table, you know, kind of tone and tenor in Wisconsin. We pay tolls to drive on your roads. I hear that a lot. But we're your playground. When you want to drive out in the country, you can either choose the soybean fields and cornfields of Illinois, which are quite boring and flat, or you could come to our glacially sculptured lakes and rivers and streams and snowmobiling and fishing and no end of good outdoor life that is offered here in Wisconsin, and you don't have to pay any tolls. So I hear that all the time, and mostly it's tongue-in-cheek, but it sort of does echo Cubs, Brewers, Bears, Packers. There's just a nice, fun rivalry, and the rivalry is the sort of the tone that underlies things.
Other questions?
So I actually
Can I
have
ask,
one,
oh, you have
if
one?
you don't
Okay,
mind.
because I had one final one. Go ahead, Jerry.
Jerry Boyle with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and over the past several years, we've had some of our staff out talking to a lot of local economic development leaders, many of them municipal leaders, and mayors in particular have been highly articulate about the trap that they find themselves in between, on the one hand, if you were running a business, you would not enter into the kind of agreements that you have that do not have any consequence for non-performance for a business that gets lured if they don't create the jobs and perform other things to be able to get the incentives. And yet, on the other hand, from a political standpoint, no one would ever excuse them for not playing the game. You can't be the first municipal leader to say, we're not playing that game, we're not going to try to attract that business, we're out of that. So I wonder if you have any insights on if there has been any place that has successfully been able to break out of that trap specifically, or if that's something that perhaps by having some sort of regional cooperation, we might be able to begin to provide some cover to leaders who say, we either get performance or we're not playing this game.
Greg, do you think Chicago has done that a little bit?
You're getting beyond my area of expertise. John might know a little more about this than I do. I'm not aware of a system that's been set up anywhere that really works. My impression generally, because there's all kinds of, in the newspaper business, there's certain, there's certain areas you can always write a scandal about. Find a nursing home, you can write a scandal about what's going on. Find some kind of economic development program, and you're almost certainly going to find copy there. You correctly state the conundrum. The companies know that municipalities are job hungry, and they have figured out, or states, and you just pull one up against the other, and you get the best deal you can. I mean, it's not by coincidence that Amazon let it be known that, gee, we want interested parties. Here's what we want, everybody. They didn't do it in a vacuum. It's really hard to say no, and frankly, to stop it is going to take national action, not regional action, and I don't see that happening. Not as long as you have a country where there's still big disparities and regional economic growth.
So I guess that's my last question to all of you then. What is the price you see long term of this status quo?
Oh, I'll start then. Kelly handed out a handout, a fact sheet of the various counties. And you can see on the bar graphs, in about 15 seconds, you can see that they're all moving at different speeds. And there are some that are sucking wind economically. And some of them are in Wisconsin. And, until you have a cognizance that a region is going to need to have its global connectivity to to literally build. I was working in Germany. That's the last place that tried to build a wall, thinking that you could shut out global forces, and it came down. But to try to build walls, to work in an environment right now where you're trying, where you literally think you could shut out the world economy, rip up the trade deals, and in that environment, I think it's going to, just on common sense, I think it's going to just solidify the status quo. And if you're happy with rural stagnant regions and rural urban centers, then that's probably what you'll get.
Jed, what about you?
I just wonder on all of this. I see two things. First of all, thanks for not making me answer the question to a Fed because I don't have my attorney with me. It's previous comment, but the what I guess I just don't get the idea of like who's going to lead this thing. Who's going to say, all right, we're all going to work together from Indiana up to Milwaukee. Obviously, the Federal Reserve has the MSA to work with, and I think in Lake County, Indiana, some of the municipalities have ceded some of the economic development to a couple of regional agencies, and they've had success with that. So if you projected that idea to say, all right, well, just within the county, we're doing okay by centralizing some of the economic development brain power, what would that mean if we were to do it as a region? And it just seems theoretically like a great idea. I just don't know who would lead that.
I think the answer to what happens is if you don't improve the status quo, is you get more of what you got, which isn't very good regionally. This region is underperforming as a region. All three states are underperforming as states. There are pockets of improvement, particularly centered around downtown Chicago, but I don't know if that's enough to carry the load by itself. Are people eventually going to say, I'm sick and tired of this, it doesn't work, and have a revolution of sorts? Well, we elected Donald Trump. He's certainly doing some different things. I have my doubts about whether making America a big factory country again is going to happen, and whether those kinds of jobs are there, but he's certainly trying. But if you don't change, you don't change. And right now, what's here needs a lot of work.
So Amazon, do you see that as that you started by talking about that, and maybe let's just end with that. Do you see the outcome of that as possibly, because what we've talked about is sort of the economic realities forcing change?
I mention Amazon because if we're going to turn it around, you have to break out of this negativity. And the best way to negativity is show this big, shining success that'll get all of us to drop our differences and pull together. You need something like that at a regional level, something that will convince the normal bickerings and back and forth, and we're better than you are, and you're looking down your nose at us. Put that out of the way. To really have a regional cooperation in an area with dramatic differences, political, economic, cultural, social, it's going to take something like that.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you. Greg Hines, Jed Dudlow, John Schmidt, thanks so much.